For 438 days, journalist Mohamed Fahmy languished behind bars in an Egyptian prison, falsely accused of conspiring with the banned Islamist group, the Muslim Brotherhood. After 2 trials and a massive social media campaign, he was finally freed. Now he is a dedicated advocate for other journalists imprisoned for simply doing their jobs. Mohamed Fahmy is co-founder of the Fahmy Foundation, an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia, and he joins us now. And I have to tell you how good it is to meet you in person.
Thank you very much for having me. You know, the last time we spoke,
it was not good, Mohamed.
I was in panic mode in Cairo before the second trial, and I mean, the support I got from the Canadian media was impeccable. But unfortunately, after we spoke, I ended up back in prison, and it wasn't that great of a time.
As you think back on all that, because we did do a Skype interview, and as you point out, it was a difficult time for you at that moment. What was the secret for you just getting through it all?
The secret for me getting through it all was knowing that the why I was there, and also knowing that so many people are fighting for me outside, and this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about a bigger cause, press freedom, human rights, and I wanted to fight the battle, and that's what kept me going, basically.
It looked like you were going to get out, and then of course they said, not so fast, you're going back in. What was that moment like?
Oh, it was horrible, because you taste freedom. And I got married, and I got a hands-on approach on the media and dealing with the lawyers. And then Amal Clooney, my lawyer, came to Egypt, and we all went to the court that day, hoping that, and pretty much sure that they're not going to send me back to prison. I even entered the cage with my phone and wallet, and I said goodbye to them. I'll be back in a couple of minutes, and suddenly I realized that I'm going back to the same prison again. It was pretty harsh back then.
What kind of conclusions did you therefore come to about the country of your birth?
Well, to be honest, the state of press freedom in Egypt is horrific at the moment. It's really tough, and especially that I was there in 2011 reporting for CNN during the uprising and the revolution. A lot of Canadian Egyptians and American Egyptians came back with hopes, filmmakers, poets, writers, journalists, hoping that, it's finally here. We're getting rid of this dictator, and we're going to move on. And suddenly, things didn't go well after that. It's like somebody pulled the carpet, and my imprisonment represented a very symbolic situation that it was a mirage at the end of the day.
What kinds of people were you in jail with?
Oh boy, I was with, Al-Qaeda fighters, ISIS sympathizers and fighters, and, the presidential team from the Muslim Brotherhood that was running the country for a whole year. So it was like a lifelong exclusive. Journalists like us spend lifetime trying to get so close to these people to interview them. Many of our friends have died doing that. And here I was, 24 hours a day, living with these guys. Of course, there were bars between us, but I did a lot of interviews, and I started a sort of a mock radio show inside the prison with my colleagues, and we interviewed them like we were on air. And we got so much information that I'm putting now in my book.
Interesting. Did they know who you were before you introduced yourself?
They knew who we were, but and they thought that we were on their side, because how would a journalist be in a prison like the Scorpion maximum security prison with no light, no way of telling time, 24 hours a day you're in your cell, you have very little food, no visits, and it was, they thought that we were part of them.
Given that, you know what the Stockholm Syndrome is, right? So there you are in jail with them. Any insights or greater sympathy into their cause as a result of being with them under those circumstances?
Actually, no. I don't sympathize with people who don't believe in democracy, human rights, press freedom, everything that we live for. However, there is that coexistence where now you are together against your jailer. There's the human rights aspect, in the human aspect, where you're just fighting to get more rights, an extra loaf of bread, and you have to unite together to do that. It was pretty incredible. It just brought up a whole new being in me, and surviving the prison was tough, but you have to keep a balance between your mental, your spiritual, and I got some books that helped me in that, finally, towards the end of my imprisonment.
Like what? What books?
Well, the thinnest book was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And it was, he was a survivor of the Holocaust and the Auschwitz prisons, and reading how his tragic optimism idea, where, you say yes when you're facing death and injustice, and turn that suffering into a human achievement. And that's what I always try to do. And he also has a quote that I live with now, that freedom is half the truth. So what I do now is I search for the truth, because why this case happened, what's the backstory, and I try to help others, journalists, through my foundation. I hope that I can make a difference and help some of these guys.
We will talk more about that in a second, but indulge me a little bit more about your experience behind bars. Was there a moment when you gave up?
Well, the hardest moment was being sentenced to 7 years. And if you see the video on the internet, I'm clinging to the bars and I'm being pulled by 7 officers. And you see your mother and your wife on the other side of the bars, and they're in tears. And a lot of the journalists were crying, and the diplomats. It was unbelievable. I've never seen anything like that before. 3 recognized journalists thrown in, and for the first time in Egypt's history as well, in a terrorist case. It was pretty intense. That was the hardest point. But then, you know, your system gears up and you start the fight again. So lots of ups and downs throughout the whole time.
Who delivered the news to you that you were finally going to be let go?
Oh, I was, after a prison visit, you know, and after a visit you go back to your cell and you're very depressed and down and out, because you see your folks after 15 days, you know, and it's only a 45-minute visit. And then as soon as I walked in, a lot of the prisoners were saying, "You're going home, you're free, you've been pardoned."
How did they know?
From the radio.
Oh.
And then we looked in, we had a small TV towards the end, and they only had 3 government channels, you know, and our names were being called out. We couldn't believe it. We were dancing in the cell and hugging each other, and 10 minutes later, we were actually left out on the street without any phones or wallets or any way to call our families, but we were just happy to be out.
Yeah, could you believe that you were actually out?
It was, you know, I
mean, given the way things have been going, they could have let you out and then, for all you know, arrested you and thrown you back in.
No, I think, you know, they learned their lesson, as in my case at least, because I just went back, by the way, and I spent 2 months in Egypt. You know, we've had so much support diplomatically from the UN, the world leaders, the press in Canada, Ottawa, and the government, and you know, so. I don't think they want to mess with me, at least.
Well, you're saying now that you're getting support from the government, but back then you were not saying that. What was your view about how the previous Conservative government was handling your case?
I was the last to join the chorus. I came out of prison, and everyone was very shocked at the mild stance of how Mr. Harper's government dealt with the case. I mean, they were trying, but they weren't trying hard enough, meaning that he delegated his responsibilities to a very, very helpful ambassador on the ground. But when you're dealing with a complicated case like that, because our case is not just a simple case, it wasn't just about press freedom, it was an issue between Gulf states and Egypt, and a geopolitical battle, and we were the pawns. So I needed Mr. Harper to call the Egyptian president, like Mr. Tony Abbott, the former Australian Prime Minister, called President Sisi because of Peter Gresta, who was with me in prison. So, you know, right now I have written a protection charter with Amnesty International, and we've submitted it to Ottawa, suggesting ideas and articles to better protect Canadians abroad when they're traveling.
This is your mission in life now, in some respects, isn't it? This protection charter. Do you know whether Canada is going to sign on to that?
Well, it has 12 articles, including enshrining and making it a law. Right now, it's at the discretionary of the government to intervene when a Canadian prisoner is detained abroad. We hope that it becomes a law that obligates the government to do that. Now, that's part of one article. Other articles include establishing a mechanism, a very clear mechanism of how the government on the ground and the ambassadors deal with the family, the NGOs. When do they deal with the media? Well, how do they? It's basically to improve consular services. And it's not just my initiatives. There's another initiative at the moment written by a former diplomat, Mr. Guy Party, who has also been submitted to Ottawa. And we've had roundtables with former detainees like Maher Arar and others and NGOs, and because it really is becoming very turbulent in the Middle East, and you know, there are almost 1,000 Canadians imprisoned abroad. Some are facing serious human rights violations, and anyone could be in my situation. It's not just a journalist or a worker aide who's on the front line. It's also a doctor, a university student. Anyone overnight can be in my similar situation. So you want your government there. You want a very clear mechanism and a system that extracts you before you die or get tortured or worse.
Speaking of torture, you are also asking Canada to sign on to the United Nations Anti-Torture Convention. How would that change things if we were, in fact, to do that?
We went to Ottawa 2-3 days ago, and we had a Amnesty and others, and we came in with our speeches to call on the government to sign on. But Mr. Dion, Foreign Affairs, came up to the podium before any of us spoke, and he said, "It's not optional anymore. We are taking the first steps. We're going to sign it." So we all had to change our speeches. It was great. Something really good happened, and that's this government here is listening to people, I think. They're responding, they're listening, and it's a great spirit of change, and I'm very excited about that. So by signing on to this UN convention, protocol against torture, which has been in the works for 13 years, Canada has not ratified, that means we can encourage other countries to sign on, especially countries in the Middle East, and that means that would allow supervisors and researchers to enter the prisons and protection delegates to make sure no one is being tortured and to minimize the torture, save lives, basically. Easy said than done, because after that you'd have to worry about other obstacles like implementing it and transparency and so on, but it's a step forward.
It's a start.
Yeah.
Your foundation, you set that up. What's it going to do?
The foundation, we're advocating for many prisoners abroad and Canadians as well, and we donate money towards their legal fees. A lot of what happened in my case, people were donating money through crowdfunding because I needed cash to get out of prison. I mean, the mail that I got in prison, the hundreds of letters were great. They raised my morale, but you need money also. So we do that. We just donated to an Ethiopian journalist in Ethiopia who's, again, facing horrific charges, because a lot of what's happening now is that governments across the world are using these fluid terrorism laws to throw you in prison. And it's not acceptable. We are facing an unprecedented attack on press freedoms and human rights in the world. Yes, we need to fight terrorism with very clear laws and actions, but we cannot lose the civil liberties. There has to be this balance that makes a good leader between civil liberties and fighting terrorism, and that's what we stand for in Canada. So we do also advocate, we meet with the lawyers, we meet with the families. It's a one-stop shop. People come to me and I give a little bit of my advice. I talk about them in the media and so on. And we've merged with the Canadian Journalists for Freedom of Expression, a very rooted group here, NGO, and with Amnesty, and we're trying to make some good things there.
I'm going to read you an excerpt now. This is, of course, we just had World Press Freedom Day this past week, and this is from a piece written by Lisa Laflamme, who's the anchor, of course, of CTV National News. She was on the jury for the World Press Freedom Award, and here's what she said. She said, "Things that stun me as a Canadian journalist are part of normal life in so many parts of the world, like getting an envelope of cash for covering a press conference by a private company or government department. The guy standing at the podium is literally buying positive coverage. In Vietnam, they call it coffee and tea money. In Cambodia, gasoline money. In DRC, coupage. We call it bribery. I could go on forever about the tactics used to stifle or control the media in different places around the world, but you get my point. In Canada, we don't really celebrate World Press Freedom Day because we don't need to. Essentially, we have it, but it's the polar opposite in so many other places." Based on your experience, do we take our press freedom for granted here in this country?
Oh man, I've been to many of these countries in Iraq and Libya and other places, and I've seen what she's talking about in terms of those envelopes, and it's pretty despicable, to say the least. But I do believe that we don't have a press freedom issue per se in Canada.
Although we did drop on the list.
Yeah, but
we dropped 10 spots on the list.
We bought 10 spots. We dropped 10 spots on by the Reporters Without Borders listed just recently that we dropped 10 spots during Mr. Harper's time mainly, or it's based on a lot of that, and they call it a dark time for journalism in Canada. So we do have our issues, and for example, the issue recently with Mr. Ben Makouche from Vice News, where he was ordered to hand in the interviews and the digital messages he had with a former Calgary Canadian man who joined ISIS in Iraq. And of course, he was ordered by the RCMP to give his notes in, and that's not acceptable, And
explain why, because some people will say Why can't the RCMP have those notes if it leads to the prosecution and eventual imprisonment of somebody who's a dangerous person? What's the principle you're fighting for there?
The principle we're fighting for is that we don't work for the government as journalists. If we start giving these notes, no one will trust us, whether it's a whistleblower or whether it's someone you're interviewing. And you know what? If we're criticizing what was happening to me in Egypt, what's happening to Ben, for example, is pretty similar. You know, when I showed up in court in Egypt, they were running audio and video of an interview I did with Mohamed al-Zawahiri, the brother of the leader of Al-Qaeda, and that was taken from my phone and using it as evidence against me. Well, that is what we do. We interview killers, rapists, terrorists to bring the news to the people at home. So if Ben and Vice lost this case, but they're appealing as far as I understand. So we can't have stuff like that. I mean, if they wanted the notes, maybe they should do his job. I mean, the journalist did a meticulous job. He got on the net, he got on this Kickstarter website, and he picked up the news. So things like that worry me a lot when I come back to Canada and I see that.
Even if Canada has dropped 10 spots on that list of press freedom, we're still pretty high up the list compared to every other country.
Of course.
And I wonder what countries, in your mind, are the most concerning for you right now?
Turkey, definitely. It's pretty bad over there. Egypt has a major problem, and it's ongoing today as we speak. There are many journalists at the Egyptian Journalism Syndicate protesting this matter. There's a little bit of confusion because some of them are being arrested for their journalism and some of them are being arrested for their affiliation with Islamist groups, but they happen to be journalists. That's why sometimes the numbers are high. But if Egypt and other countries in the Middle East want to begin to promote a democratic image, they need to respect press freedoms and release people like Mahmoud Shawkan, who I'm fighting for in my organization, an Egyptian photographer who's been in prison for 2 years without a trial for taking a photo. And I visited his folks just when I came back, tried to get him a lawyer. And it's complicated. No one should spend time behind bars for his ideas or beliefs or journalism, basically.
Let's finish up there. You spent more than a year behind bars. I presume that changes you as a person. How?
It changes me as a person because it's right now, it's not just about being on the front line before anyone else and getting the byline and the exclusive. It's more than that. It's about trying to make a change using not just my pen and camera like I did before, but also advocating very loudly. I know, and it's a thin line between journalism and advocacy. But if you keep this objectivity, and at the moment I'm not back on the field again, I'm really going strong in advocating for journalists across the world. And I can't forget Khadija Ismailova, who is detained in Azerbaijan, and she won the award by the UN in Helsinki on the World Press Freedom Day. I'm fighting for her also and keeping her plight alive. She's represented by lawyer Amal Clooney, who represented me and was a game changer in my release. And I just spoke to Amal a couple of days ago, and she's fighting for her in the States with the State Department. And after my release, a lot of these governments wanted to hear from me. What works? What doesn't work? I went to the British government. I went to the State Department. I went to Ottawa, and they all wanted to know, when is a good time to intervene in Egypt? When should we wait? Because there is this hyper-nationalism where countries worry about foreign meddling and they don't want anyone dipping into their business. But there's always a way to push in the right time with the right pace.
Keep on keeping on, as they say. Mohamed, it's great to have you here at
Thank you
TVO
very
tonight.
much.
Congratulations on your safety and in your work to come. Thank you
very much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.